In the hot summer of 1944, leaders from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods.
Heads the American delegation. All agreements must be ratified by the governing bodies of the nation.
They were on a mission to create a global financial system that would become a new standard after the end of World War II. As a result of this meeting, they established International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and famous Bretton Woods System. Under this system, countries agreed to peg their currency to the US dollar, and the US dollar, in turn, was pegged to gold. On the one hand, this helped nations who suffered the most from the war as their economy now was linked to the most powerful economy in the world. On the other hand, countries became dependent on the Federal Reserve System since any deviations from the chosen exchange rate must be discussed at the IMF with the USA representative. At the same time, a 13-year-old Jewish boy in Hungary was barred from attending school and could no longer plan his own future under the Nazi occupation. This boy's name was George Soros. Little did he know, in 50 years he would demolish the economy of the United Kingdom, whose representative was in Bretton Woods, thinking about newly establishing world order. When George was 17, he became a student at the London School of Economics and later graduated with a bachelor's and master's degree in philosophy. During that time, Soros was working as a waiter, a railway porter, and a seller in a souvenir shop. After graduating, he planned to work as a professor, but his grades were not high enough. For the lack of other ideas, he wrote to every managing director in every bank in London hoping to get any available position. He received just one response. Singer and Friedlander Bank offered him a clerk position. In 1970, after changing another 3 positions in different banks and moving to the US, George Soros established his own company, Soros Fund Management.
George Soros last fall, after his great currency coup,
which eventually will become famous Quantum Fund. And while he was obtaining investments for this new fund, President Richard Nixon announced the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold.
I directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
That was the end of Bretton Woods System. Soon enough, European countries started to suffer from high inflation and exchange rate instability. That affected international trade, poverty levels, unemployment, and, of course, people's feelings. Nations were looking for another anchor for their currencies. In 1990, taking into consideration existing economic alliances, such as the European Coal and Steel Community, they created the Exchange Rate Mechanism, or ERM.
Right. It doesn't change any of the fundamentals, and it doesn't decide whether or not the government strategy is right or wrong.
Its idea was similar to Bretton Woods System. Everyone's money was tied to Deutsche Mark as a currency of the most stable and resilient economy. ERM system set up 2.25% band and required countries to keep exchange rate movements within it. If, for example, British pound strengthens, then central bank must intervene and decrease interest rate or start selling the pound on a public market to weaken the currency. And that's when the most interesting part begins. At that time, inflation in the UK was quite high, around 9%, while the economy itself was in contraction phase with almost null or even negative GDP growth. In order to stay within the boundaries defined by the ERM system and to prevent the collapse of the economy, the Bank of England set interest rates at 10%. But keeping interest rates high wasn't enough to maintain the pound's value. So, the Bank of England started to use its foreign exchange reserves to buy pound on the open market. Similar situation was with other countries such as Italy and Denmark. That's when the market sensed blood. Every currency trader realized that current exchange rate between pound and Deutsche Mark is artificial. Eventually, the UK government will have to devalue pound. But everyone was waiting for some catalysator. George Soros was one of these speculators, and he decided to make the first move. His strategy was simple. He went to a big bank, asked the manager to borrow pounds, then sold these pounds on the open market and bought Deutsche Mark, hoping that when the exchange rate drops, he will be able to buy pounds back cheaper and return money to the lender with some interest on top. Within 2 months, he sold over 10 billion pounds and other traders decided to support him. However, the Bank of England was not ready to stand by. On September 17, 1990, they bought 3 billion pounds from the market, but it barely moved the rate. On the same day, Britain announced that they would raise interest rates by another 2%, knowing that this decision could destroy the economy. The government was in a panic because this decision didn't help at all. By the end of the day, they purchased a total of 27 billion pounds and increased the interest rate one more time to 15%. But they underestimated market power since Soros alone sold a third of that amount. At the end of the day, British government capitulated with the following news conference.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism. As chairman of the Council of European Finance Ministers, I have called a meeting of the Monetary Committee in Brussels urgently tonight to consider how stability can be restored to foreign exchange markets. In the meantime, the government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
Next day, the British pound fell by 15% against the Deutsche Mark and by 25% against the US dollar. A little boy from Hungary who was dreaming only about the end of the war has now made $1 billion in profit. As a postscriptum, I should mention that even though that day is called Black Wednesday as one of the worst days for the UK economy, it turns out that it brought many opportunities for the country. Firstly, the Bank of England finally cut interest rates that allowed the economy to start the recovery process. Secondly, the country abandoned the ERM system and, as a result, became independent in terms of monetary policy. By 1997, the English pound was even more valuable than it was during the ERM. So, who knows? Maybe George Soros did Britain a favor.